Okay, so I said that we were going to be using Title IX as a case study to help us bring the policy process to light. In order to do that, let's just talk a little bit about what Title IX is. We're going to be learning about this later in the semester, um, but let's talk about what Title IX is and how it impacts our lives. Well, Title IX is an amendment to the Higher Education Act of 1965. And it's basically the law, you're probably familiar with it. It's the law that prohibits sex discrimination in any school that is receiving federal funding. Okay. So basically, it is an expansion of civil rights laws as it relates to education. And there's just the wording of Title IX. I'll put it up there. You could take a pause and take a look at it. But like I said, we're going to be um, going into detail with Title IX and a lot more later in the semester when we get to the topic on education. How does it, Title IX impact our lives? In other words, why is it important? Well, it impacts our lives because it basically says that students and employees cannot be subject to discrimination. Uh, Student employees of any institution of education that gets federal fundings can't be subject to discrimination due to their gender, due to their pregnancy, marital status, parenthood. Before Title IX, a woman or a man who applied to a school could be rejected in the admissions process because of their gender. Women would be rejected from law school, men would be rejected from nursing school and teaching school as well. And so Title IX brings that kind of discrimination to an end. You probably heard about Title IX because one of the impacts of Title IX is that it led to having gender equity in sports. And so the thinking was that a lot of the scholarships go to sports that guys play. And Title IX said, well, you have to sort of have equal scholarships, right? That you have to open up sports opportunities for women in order for them to have the same equal accessibility to playing sports, but also getting scholarships for sports. Um, After Title IX was passed, one of the ways it was expanded was amending Title IX to make sure that a schools must address sexual violence and sexual harassment. Um, and that was in part with the Violence Against Women's Act that we'll be learning about later on in the semester. And so basically, because if you go to a school and it's filled with sexual violence, you fear for your safety, then you really can't get equal access to education. Um, so schools it's sort of discriminatory. So schools need to address sexual violence in order to be in compliance with Title IX. And most recently, Title IX has been expanded to cover not just discrimination as it relates to sex and gender, but it's been expanded to include transgender students also. That gender identity or gender nonconforming folks cannot be discriminated against. But I have dot 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 maybe because things changed under the Trump administration. So under the Obama administration, in terms of the implementation of Title IX, they directed public schools to allow students to use bathrooms that align with their gender identity. When Trump got into office, his Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, along with Attorney General, they rescinded that guidance and basically said that they left it to schools themselves to decide the kinds of protections that transgender and gender nonconforming students would receive. So that's really kind of a good example of the ways in which laws are implemented and how different administrations can implement laws in different ways. Okay, so let's look at the first step of the policy making process with problem identification and the agenda. And so, as I stated before, that individuals and groups demand that government addresses a problem or an issue. And your public policy textbook relates to that as a policy debate. It's like an argument over an issue, right? That and that is part of what identifies problems, but then also allows it to get it on the agenda. And your textbook also talks about this thing called a policy community, which is a network of political actors that try to raise awareness about an issue and try to get it on the agenda. And so this happens through focusing attention on the media, on public interest groups, on public officials, trying to get them aware of the problem. How did that play itself out with Title IX? In Title IX, that Title IX was a response to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there were prohibitions against discrimination when it came to race and sex, when it came to employment. But Civil Rights Act of 1969 only prohibits racial discrimination in schools, but it doesn't go as far as prohibiting gender discrimination. There was a lot more buy-in that people shouldn't be discriminated when it comes to education based on their race. There wasn't as much buy-in, again, the historical context and sort of the values of the time, that there was sort of this, when it came to education, that maybe it was better to have separate, classrooms for boys and girls, or maybe it made sense to prohibit certain kinds of people, men, from pursuing certain kinds of fields like nursing and teaching. So it was the Civil Rights Act that is sort of spurs the problem identification and the policy debate. The thinking is the policy debate is, wait a second, is treating women differently in education justified? And the debate, ensues, and the thinking is, no, it's not justified. That we need to end sexual discrimination of federal funding in educational institutions. And then a policy community kind of develops around the answer to that debate question about that sex discrimination is not justified. And so you get groups like the National Organization of Women who start coalescing around this issue of education equality, and also the Women's Equity Action League. And so they start raising awareness about this and getting it on the policy agenda. And then you have activists and lawmakers such as Bernice Sanders and Representative Edith Green and Patsy Mink and also Senator Birch Bayh, all are kind of get on board as part of this policy community that is demanding change. So here's just some pictures of Bernie Sanders and then the National Organization of Women marching on the issue of educational equality. Bernie Sanders is interesting because she was applied for admissions to 20 different schools, and that actually I've got that wrong. It was Patsy Minks from Hawaii, who applied to 20 different medical schools and was denied admissions. Bernice Sanders, she was wanting to move up to be full professor, and they denied her that because of her gender. And they said that she came off as being too strong for a woman, and she sued as well. And so both of those are sort of examples of this people taking action, suing in order to get a perceived problem on the agenda. The next step is that formulation and legitimation. Again, just as a reminder, the formation is the creation of the law or the public policy by lawmakers, interest groups, think tanks, and the legitimation of that is the enactment of policy by Congress, the president, and the courts. How did that play itself out for Title IX? Well, it was introduced as an amendment to the Higher Education Act of 1965. So there was an existing act that was on the books, and Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana presented that amendment, that the language of Title IX saying that people can't be discriminated against in educational facilities on the basis of sex. And it was passed by Congress, and guy had really strong support. This was a time period, and we're going to be learning about this later on, where issues of gender equality, support for the Equal Rights Amendment, and even support for abortion, it didn't break down along party lines like the way that it does today. You had Republicans and Democrats who supported this act, obviously. It passed 88-6 in the Senate and 275-125 in the House. And that not only that, but it's signed into law by President Nixon, a Republican, in June of 1972. And so, that's that formation and legitimation. Here you see the two lawmakers, Edith Green and Patsy Minks, who are co-authored drafts with Birch Bayh of the Title IX language. And there is a picture of President Nixon signing it into law.